Y luego allá atrás tienes como un link para, por ejemplo, cualquier entidad, casi automáticamente no cuadra.
Sí, mira,
Cualquier entidad. Caja de luces. Vamos si quieres hacer un paseo por ahí. Muchísimo más que todos los demás. De las clases psicológicamente parecía que yo era el oponente de los Marco. Lo primero me dijo, bueno, soy no habla de mi flor.
As the chair appointed by the Sibelius Academy Board, I hereby declare the public examination of Master of Music composer Uljas Pulkkis demonstration of proficiency open. I wish you all welcome to this academic event. Especially, I wish warmly welcome the esteemed examiners of this event. The thesis examiner, Professor Stephen McAdams from the Scully School of Music, McGill University. Early in the morning in Montreal, Quebec, online here. There is now only the small picture, but it will be bigger later on. And then the chair of the artistic committee is Professor Mieko Kanno from the Sibelius Academy. Welcome. The rest of the artistic committee, unfortunately not present here today, are Professor Emeritus Conductor Atso Almila, Professor and Composer Jean-Baptiste Barrière, Professor Philippe Essling from IRCAM, and Professor of Conducting at the Sibelius Academy, Sakari Orama. I'm Dr. Ulla Pohjanmaro from the Sibelius Academy Docmus Doctoral School, and I chair this event. This is how we proceed today. Doctoral candidate Uljas Pulkkis will first give his lectio precursoriae. You will find information about him and his doctoral project on the program booklet. After the lectio, we will hear the statements of the artistic committee and the thesis examiner. Then there will be the discussion between the esteemed examiners and the doctoral candidate. And we have agreed to speak to each other in informal fashion. Last, after the final statements of the examiners, the audience may propose questions and comments to the doctoral candidate. Now, let's begin. Candidate Pulkkis, please, the floor is yours.
Honored Chair, honored examiners, ladies and gentlemen. In this lectio precursoria, I will first tell how I got the idea for this doctoral project. Then an overview to the score tool app, and lastly, about my artistic work in the project and the project results in the written report. I also play recorded examples of the analyzed music. The initial idea for this score tool project came to my mind already in the late 90s when I was composing my first orchestral works. The overwhelming amount of timbral possibilities in symphony orchestra felt devastating to me, and I thought about using an algorithm to find the timbres I need for the composition. Back then, I used Lisp language for algorithms and used it only for generating pitches for certain kind of spectral harmonies. The idea of coding something based on timbre of instruments was beyond my skills then. So timbre finding algorithm remained just an idea. Another topic of interest for me was the mutual balance of orchestral instrument sounds. In my first orchestral compositions, I experienced differences between compositional intentions and the performance. Often the issue was that something that I intended to be in the foreground of the texture was not. The inaudibility of the intended foreground texture is surprisingly common in orchestral compositions, not only in contemporary music, but also in standard repertoire. In many well-known pieces, the written dynamics in the work does not produce the best possible outcome. This is something that was told us by Esa-Pekka Salonen himself during his summer courses in 1999 and 2000. Salonen showed that some scores from well-known composers where the conductor must rebalance the dynamics in order to get the best sounding result. Salonen also stressed us composers that if you want something to be audible, create a tunnel around it. And by tunnel, he meant that do not write anything else in the same register. This Salonen's rule of thumb works often very well. But in my experience, the key parameter to have something audible in an orchestral piece is not only the written register. For example, a male singer and a trombone can very well be written in the same register and have both sounds audible. And on the other way around, a bassoon 2 octaves below flute can render flute inaudible. The audibility is linked to many parameters, including the overtone structure, psychology, acoustics, and psychoacoustics. Now, fast forward 20 years and 46 composed orchestral pieces later. I am still interested in algorithms and audibility of the foreground texture, and I have gained good experience in writing for orchestra, as well as knowledge about coding by doing hobby projects. Of course, during these years, the rest of the world did not stand still, and there are a bunch of software written for my initial purpose, mainly the excellent org idea program, where you can find an orchestration to match your input sound. I also noticed that I do not myself need that much the timbre finding algorithm, but more a program that validates my orchestration choices in advance to minimize the need for revisions during the rehearsal period of the first performance. To validate something with an algorithm, one must know exactly what to validate. In orchestration, that is a tricky question, because it is often hard to point out exactly what the essential parameters are. During the composing work, I have a certain kind of idea of the timbre and texture I want, and if the performance does not match that, I need to adjust something and hear it again. But in the case of audibility, there is often lack of time to experiment which exact instruments are causing the trouble. As a composer, I want to use the full potential of the orchestra. In other words, to orchestrate big and cheesy sounding passages here and there, and this can be also called full-bodied texture. I don't mean that everything has to sound big, but I like to have the full-bodied orchestration in my toolbox when I write music. Especially in the beginning of my career, I wrote many solo instrument concertos. In terms of audibility, I naturally want the solo instrument to be audible all the time. But also, I do not want to sacrifice the beauty of full-bodied sound to the solo instrument audibility. This is a complex equation to solve, because full-bodied sound is linked to the presence of wide selection of frequencies in sounding image. To achieve the full-bodied sound, the orchestration requires the use of many instruments in different registers, which very easily leads to the solo instrument sound to be masked by the orchestration. This issue is often recognized by the soloists themselves, and in private conversations, some of them revealed tricks they use in case they feel overpowered by the orchestra. One trick, especially in the case of string instruments, is to use heavy vibrato, which makes the solo sound to be distinguishable from the orchestral mass. Another trick is to play just slightly ahead of orchestra, so that the first sound in a beat audience hear is the solo instrument sound. Time-wise, this ahead playing can be just in dozens of milliseconds, which is enough to be noticed by our hearing system. The third trick is the most surprising one, told me by a very distinguished player. He plays deliberately slightly out of tune, usually a bit sharp, to separate his instrument from the orchestral sound. Of course, this requires a high level of musicality to do it right. In my written report, I present examples from my compositions over the years with audibility issues. The examples include double concerto crystallizations where the solo accordion was often inaudible. The orchestral piece Trial, where the solo by the concertmaster could not be heard, most likely by something playing more than octave below. And also examples from my operas, where the solo singer occasionally has been completely drowned by orchestration. These all cases are examples where the damage is already done, and the musicians are just trying to do their best with the material they have. And as I said, these kind of audibility issues are not the annoyance of myself or even my fellow composers, but in the case of standard repertoire, the convention is that the registers and notated pitches are sacred. You do not just octave transpose or leave out the instrument that is disturbing the soloist, but rather over their dynamics. That is why, for example, why many orchestral fortes in various cello and violin concertos are nowadays played with so piano. But in the case of us living composers, we are free to alter anything we like. Thus, the audibility issue seemed to me the optimal case for validating the orchestration programmatically. It is a very specific and common issue, and all the data to solve it should already be available, scattered around in various scientific and artistic papers. In my research, I call the sound of which audibility is tested the target. So that is the core of my doctoral project, how to test audibility of target in orchestration. In my written report, I have gathered information from various sources concerning the target audibility. I have included aspects from artistic, acoustic, psychoacoustic, and music psychology perspectives, as well as experiences from the works of mix engineers and orchestrators. My main focus is on auditory masking, which is a psychoacoustic phenomenon that occurs inside our hearing system. The auditory masking aspect covers perhaps the majority of cases where the target sound is lost and can be algorithmicized if all the data is known. I also try to algorithmize other aspects such as blending and timbre homogeneity. These algorithms can be said to be in experimental state, but the masking algorithm should be somewhat reliable. I implemented all these algorithms into the computer application score tool, which I coded myself as a part of this project. The score tool app is not only free to use and download, but it's also a non-profit open source project. This means that the source code is available and can be freely modified and enhanced for the benefit of the community. Next, I will tell in short how the score tool app works. With score tool app, a composer can, for example, run a pre-evaluation of the score before the rehearsals. With the data, composer will know the problematic bars beforehand, along with the exact instruments that cause the trouble. With the data, the composer will thus have the solution at hand if the audibility problems occur. In score tool, the audibility can be tested for a single instrument or a group of instruments, such as a woodwind section. The analytical data output is in color-coded visual form and can be saved to the device for offline use. For this to work, the real instrument sound spectrum must be available. Every composer nowadays is familiar with the sample libraries that play the score in the notation program. Likewise, they are familiar for how different the balance of sounds is in computer compared to real life. Also, the notation program sample libraries are commercial and thus cannot be used in an open source project. Therefore, I used the samples that were recorded at the University of Iowa because they are free to use by anyone for any purpose, and added some sounds from VSCO library, which is another open source sample library. Instrument sounds are recorded in 3 dynamic levels from piano to forte. The beauty of the Iowa library is that the sounds are recorded in an anechoic chamber without any technical adjustments between takes. So the mutual dynamic balance of the instruments is untouched. And this also gives reference to the sounds from the other library I used. For example, the sound power of the forte of the saxophone in VSCO would be somewhere between fortes of clarinet and trumpet in Iowa. I also had a privilege of using a real orchestra for final adjustments of the dynamic levels. I sat 2 days with the decibel meter in a hall where the orchestra made the first walkthrough of my opera score. Every now and then, I asked if some instrument section could play their part solo, so I got the decibel readings. The orchestra playing was also recorded with an artificial head, so I could listen to playing afterwards and check the orchestral balance. For mimicking the seating order, I also implemented in score tool a real acoustic model of Helsinki Music Center acoustics with the help of Professor Tapio Lokki. The model is based on Tapio Lokki's recorded IR responses in different places around the stage and the hall. The model can be used to change the seating placement to see its effect to the audibility and timbre. The model includes the possibility to analyze the orchestration either from the conductor's or the audience's seat. The score tool app does not play the whole score for the user, but dissects it into multiple vertical orchestral chords that are analyzed individually. For every chord, the user sees graphs showing the analytical data of the orchestration. With the app, it is easy to add or subtract instruments to and from orchestration and change their dynamic levels, while seeing the results in graphs in real time. Unlike the whole score, the individual chords can be played as audio. The most important graph is the one that shows the level of masking that the orchestration chord creates in our hearing system. The masking graph shows the approximated excitation in the receptors in our cochlea after the sound arrived there from acoustic filters and impedance changes of outer and middle ear. The key concept in the masking graph is the critical band, which limits the number of simultaneous frequencies we can hear. The number of critical bands is about 26, and the basic idea is that if two or more frequencies occur on same critical band, only the loudest one is audible. Most of the musical information of the orchestral music happens within 15 critical bands, which already sets a theoretical limit on how many different pitches one can perceive. The actual number for average person is only 4 or 5. And this is the result from the fact that a loud bass instrument can occupy maybe 10 bands, sometimes even more. That results some level of disturbance for other instruments. Or, as in example from Samuel Adler's orchestration handbook, if you write fortissimo tremolo for bass drum, don't expect to hear anything else from the orchestra. This happens because a loud peak in one critical band leaks into adjacent bands. To demonstrate this visually, here is an example of the spectrum of the horn playing middle C in different dynamics. The vertical lines are approximations of critical bands. The pianissimo playing occupies only 2 bands, where fortissimo spreads to 10 bands in the picture. Needless to say that a loud horn can render even pianissimo piccolo inaudible. Note also how the sound pressure of notated frequency component does not rise that much with the dynamics, but the loudness sensation comes from the amount of critical bands activated. To calculate the masking level, I use thoroughly tested algorithm from MPEG standard, which is developed for lossy audio compression, or in short, for MP3 files. The masking algorithm relies on so-called bark bands, which are approximations of the critical bands. The most important part of the algorithm is the spreading function, which defines how much the loud component affects the adjacent bands. I adapted this formula from the definition of ISO coding standard, which has been in use since year 94. I am aware that more accurate approximations exist, but the benefit of this model is its wide testing and efficiency. Here you see my own demo of the algorithm in practice. Here is the magnitude spectrum of flute sound. The algorithm finds the most prominent frequency peaks and apply the masking spreading function into the data. See how the spreading function accumulates towards the high frequencies. The final red line represents the A-weighted version, which takes our special sensitivity to 4 kHz frequency area into account. The hypothesis is that if we place the magnitude spectrum of any other instrument sound in the same graph, the frequency peaks under the masking level are inaudible. I made the demo with the MATLAB software. Other analysis tools in Score Tool are related to timbre and blending. The timbre algorithm calculates an estimate on how near or far the target timbre is from orchestration. The idea is that if the timbre is very close, the target might be hard to spot from orchestration, even if it's not masked. For this information to be usable, I added the estimate of timbre homogeneity of the orchestration to the app. This addition was necessary because it is not relevant to calculate the overall orchestration timbre unless the orchestration sounds homogenic. The numerical values for timbre are calculated with an MFCC algorithm borrowed from speech recognition branch, and the homogeneity algorithm is borrowed from statistic method called coefficient of variation. The correlation of the results to the sounding image is not yet tested by an official test group. Here is the example of analysis information from one orchestration code in ScoreTool app. The graphs change in real time if any parameter, such as dynamic marking or playing technique, changes. For a quick audibility check, composer can upload their score into the program, set the target, and calculate the audibility estimates, which appear as color coding in the score. This color coding shows also on each orchestration code which instruments in the orchestration might cause trouble. On the target stuff, green indicates good audibility, yellow moderate, and red weak. On other staves, red means that it is the heaviest masker, yellow second, and blue third. This color-coded score is handy in the orchestral rehearsals, where in the case of inaudible target, you just check which instruments are the possible maskers and change the registers or lower the dynamics, not the whole orchestra. The graph does not give any definite answers and must be taken as feedback for the artist. One reason is that the estimation is mono-aural, which means that the audibility can hypothetically be improved by altering the seating of masked instrument, preferably to the far left or far right on the stage. The traffic light coloring can be interpreted also so that if you see a lot of green on target, you have more artistic freedom to experiment with the timbre. But if the indication is red, it might be wise to stick with the good conventions. In my composition work, I first used the score tool to test the audibility of target in a challenging piece, in a horn concerto for large wind orchestra. The horn timbre is commonly known to be a good blender, and also the sound of wind band can easily overpower the solo horn. I used the opportunity to adjust the orchestration behind the solo to the max. It was a good lesson about how to interpret the score tool results. Although the horn sound was indeed audible in the rehearsals, even the slightest excitement of some orchestra players in the performance caused the horn to be masked. In other words, it is best to play it safe in case of soloist and run the score tool analysis with dynamics that are one notch louder than markers. Here is an excerpt from the horn concerto performance. The soloist is Tommi Hyytinen and Sami Ruusuvuori is conducting the Finnish Police Orchestra. Note especially how the orchestra makes room when the horn is playing and how horn and xylophone sounds can coexist with zero audibility issues. My doctoral project has an artistic emphasis, and that's why, as a composer, I wanted to include an artistic component in my project. During the years I spent to research aspects of audibility, I composed an opera for orchestra and soloists using the newly gained target audibility information and documented how my composition work changed with the process. The opera, titled All the Truths We Cannot See, a Chernobyl story, was an evaluated artistic component of this doctoral project. The experience I gained from horn concerto was very, very valuable for final orchestral adjustments for the opera. I checked with score tool that the masking level of the orchestration was this time well below the singers. So there was room for occasional loud dynamics in the performance. I also checked the voice of the solo singers with decibel meter so that the dynamic levels of the singer samples in score tool app are correct. In next video, note how much decibel levels change when the soprano goes to high register. The soprano has one of the widest dynamic range of all instruments I measured. While composing the opera, my workflow was such that after composing a passage, I checked it with the score tool, revised it, and then checked again until I got the results I wanted. I deliberately orchestrated some passages so that I was unsure about audibility, so I can test the program in practice. In the final rehearsals that lasted approximately a week, I listened the whole work on the first day and marked the places with potential issues. On the same evening, I ran the score tool analysis on the marked places and suggested revisions according to the results on next day. This method worked, and nearly every case, the instrument indicated by score tool was the guilty one for audibility problems. In general, during the compositional process, I noticed how, for me, the instrumentation gained even more importance than before. I changed the registers of passages many times and ended up writing more in the low register than I usually do. I was also very careful with the doublings and checked the timbral closeness of the passages with unisons with score tool very often. In general, I might say that I orchestrated more lightly than before, and in the performance, the sounding image was clearer than in my previous opera from year 2019. Let's listen to a clip of the opera, a duet between two sisters, of which one wants to hate and other wants to love. Here, notice especially how the orchestration thickens when the singers hit the forte notes, and how the instruments move away from unison register when the dynamics are low. Maria Turunen is singing the soprano, Christine Lee mezzo, and Brent McMahon is conducting the Taunton Orchestra. Next, I summarize the results of my research. In the written report, which is publicly examined today, I both tell the technical aspects of orchestration and verbalize the work of a composer, myself writing an opera. In the report, there are also chapters describing how other composers than myself have used the score tool to analyze their orchestrations. In the end of the report, all my experience in this project is presented in a poster which summarizes in 7 bullets the things to consider when a composer is unsure about the audibility of the target. 1. Use a target instrument with unique timbre. The target's audibility can be enhanced by using a characteristic playing technique or sordino to alter the target's sound spectrum. The score tool app's timbre distance parameter can be used to check how unique the target timbre is compared to the orchestration. 2. Mark the target with a louder dynamic than the orchestration because soft dynamics blend better than loud ones. To avoid blending, loud dynamic is preferred. 3. Use target with bright timbre because a low spectral centroid of the target timbre makes it easier to blend. 4. Use the registral separation of the target if possible. And remember that the loudest partials may be on different register than the notated pitch. Again, score tool can help. 5. Use the spatial separation on stage for conflicting instruments. And this is a tricky one because the audibility would in theory be improved if the soloist stays on far left or far right side of the stage, but on the other hand, visual focus psychologically improves the audibility. 6. Make sure that the target fulfills the criteria of good continuation. And this comes from the field of music psychology. Avoid big leaps from one pitch to another because these break the good continuation. And 7, last one, test the target's audibility with wrong dynamics in the score tool app. Because dynamics marked in the score are relative, and the variance of realization is high, especially with soft dynamics. So change all markings to forte ones in score tool and see what the result is. Now, I hereby call upon you, honored examiners appointed by the academic board of the Sibelius Academy, to evaluate my demonstration of proficiency and to present the critical comments you deem it deserves.
Uljas, otatko sen näytön jaon pois päältä?
So we begin with the statements. Professor Kanno, Diego, please go ahead.
The opera, All the Truth We Cannot See, a Chernobyl Story, is the single large work submitted as artistic component towards the doctoral degree project in Applied Study Program by Uljas Pulkkis. The opera was premiered on 15 March 2022 in Sonore Hall, Helsinki Music Center. Of the board members, Barrier, Esme, Oramo, and myself attended the performance. Almira accessed the performance by audiovisual recording.
All the board members were provided with the score. The performance lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes, including an interval. The libretto was in English. The premiere was attended by a full house audience with many from outside the Sibelius Academy, and it was a very special occasion for all. While the pandemic continued to place restrictions on both our lives and artistic activities, the war in Ukraine began less than 1 month before this premiere. The creators of this opera could hardly have predicted how relevant the work would become in such troubled times. Despite the fact that such context was not foreseen at the time of composition, the work and performance lived up to the occasion, and we, the artistic board, feel it is important to credit the whole production team as well as the composer for the success. Also worth mentioning in this context, in the context of Uljas's work, is that the composer had cooperated with the production team in the most professional manner. We understood that the venue changed and the singers changed. There were numerous changes that were beyond his control, reflecting the fluctuating situations of the pandemic at that time. The composition of All the Truth We Cannot See, a Chernobyl Story, demonstrates that Uljas Pulkkis accomplished a solid composition, showing his craft and experience as orchestral and operatic composer. Overall, the music is colorful and keeps up the interest of the listener well. The orchestra is given a balanced role in the ensemble, with no one left to play only the accompaniment. The orchestration is more traditional than that of some contemporary operas, with hardly any contemporary performing techniques on any of the instruments used. Uljas amply demonstrates his competence in traditional orchestration, perhaps rather than striving for innovation. This is a new work that follows safely the footsteps of operatic language set by, for example, Saarinen and Rautavaara in terms of both vocal and orchestral writing. The audibility of the singers is Uljas's main concern.
As a way of gaining wider comprehension of this topic, we would like to share with the esteemed colleagues and audience today the complexity of the subject that we, the Artistic Board, observed when examining this opera. First, the topic concerns the acoustics and sonic texture. The venue Sonore Hall may not have been the most appropriate venue for the work. It occurred several times during the performance that the totality of sound appeared to be too loud, which was likely to have been caused by too small a space for the vocal and orchestral resources involved in the work. However, this perception is also concurrent with another observation that the sonic texture was generally thick. While credit goes to Uljas in having managed to make the singers come through it for the most part of the work, the overall sonic picture of the opera seemed somewhat monotonous in terms of dynamics. There were many passages in the Act 1, for example, in which the orchestra continued somewhere between mezzo-piano and mezzo-forte within a middle volume range. The sound of the orchestra was so rich that it resulted in the singers having to mostly belt out their parts. A wider dynamic range would have been welcome, especially to the lower end of the register. There were aesthetic issues too. The work had perhaps too much overall tension without critical relaxing periods, thus an overall feeling of too much. The whole opera felt very dense in terms of instrumentation and would have gained from more sparse and relaxed passages. Second, the work concerns interrelated topics of the audibility and intelligibility of the voice. If the audibility of the singers was Uljas's main concern, the singers were audible for most of the time, and it can be said that Uljas achieved his aim. At the same time, if the critical concern was the intelligibility of vocal expression beyond the voice being merely heard, the panel members raised questions. In other words, if Uljas's quest was to create an opera where the vocal parts would appear intelligible in any register and dynamic situation, achievable by being aware of the orchestral timbres and overtones, this quest seems only partially fulfilled. In part, we found the long and high-moving vocal sections quite extreme in a piece with a substantial text. The libretto was dense, and we wondered if a more pared-down use of text in music might have been helpful, perhaps in combination with interludes or some other use of text in style of music theatre, for example. We were searching for expressive contrast. For example, moments of contrast between the singers and the orchestra in a more dramatic manner, even a more fluctuating, volatile relationship between them. This also brings us to the issue of text comprehension. While it is actually the case in many operas, including classical ones, this topic is worth being addressed in depth and could represent a track for future development in Uljas's research. Lastly, I'd like to mention that the panel had the opportunity to become acquainted with a draft of Uljas's thesis at the time of the performance. We found that the goal of finding a way to write orchestral music that still leaves adequate space for human voices while keeping orchestral density is groundbreaking. Meanwhile, in the context of the opera, the panel also felt that sometimes this might have been too much an objective, and having less emphasis on this aspect might have been productive too. There was also an opinion from the panel that Uljas had probably learned from pure experience about how to solve the balance issues. A question was raised as to whether, even if such software were in use at the basic level, it would be able to take sufficient account of the different acoustics and the personal characteristics of each player or singer, not to mention the instruments themselves as individuals. We appreciate that orchestration is not only a question of balance, but also a matter of aesthetic and compositional choices. The indications provided by the software are not meant to be normative, but rather consultative. In other words, the composer or the conductor is free to use the information for their own creativity. Overall, all the truths we cannot see, a Chernobyl story demonstrates the skill, competence, and professionalism of Uljas Pulkkis as a composer. The panel agrees unanimously that the work meets the requirement as artistic component in accordance with the degree program specifications. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Adams. Stephen, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
The topic of this dissertation is the development of a computer-based environment to analyze and predict the audibility of various instruments and voices in an orchestral texture. The program's algorithms are based on formalization in computational models of various auditory principles such as masking. It addresses real issues in orchestration practice, particularly the audibility of targeted instruments such as solos in an orchestral texture. In my mind, the three parts of the report fulfill the requirements of the applied study program. Part 1 lays out the framework of relevant psychoacoustic principles and models. The review of the professional literature is quite broad and covers most of the relevant topics. The author first critically examined several orchestration treatises for evidence of taking issues of audibility and masking into account, and conclude that there is not much to be extracted of a specific nature for the computational project. He then reviews various aspects in the realm of hearing science and psychoacoustics, particularly those related to energetic masking. Although the author gets the gist of psychoacoustic issues, there were some minor errors in the way some aspects of the psychoacoustics were portrayed or explained in the pre-examination version, most of them which have been fixed. I would like to thank Uljas for sending me a version of highlighted changes to check this. Uljas could perhaps have delved a bit more into auditory scene analysis principles, which are crucial for dynamic aspects of audibility related to auditory grouping principles. But for this first approach, the results are quite satisfactory. There remains, however, a fair amount of mixing of acoustic and perceptual vocabulary. Attention should be paid to the precision of vocabulary usage. For example, intensity and level are descriptions of sound properties, whereas loudness and softness are descriptions of the perceptual results. These sometimes seem to be used interchangeably, and one needs to be careful about what one is talking about. A particularly intriguing discussion is put forth in section 6.2 of part 1 on mixing by recording engineers as orchestration practice, including not just mixing per se, but microphone and instrument placement within a hall. I think the orchestrational role of tone meisters is not recognized enough, and it is good to bring this aspect to the fore. A subsequent section explores another aspect of audibility beside that of masking, the blending of sounds and the relation of blending to timbral homogeneity. This section explores primarily the spectral aspects of sounds that condition whether they blend well or not, although future attention could also consider temporal aspects such as onset synchrony and similarity of amplitude envelopes of sounds. Part 2 describes the development of the SCORE tool program. The author has done a fairly thorough job of integrating the relevant professional literature into the realizations of his project. The document describes in clear detail the basic structure of the application, the instrument database, and the implemented algorithms for predicting audibility based on psychoacoustic model. He notes that a delicate issue in making predictions from a score is interpreting notated dynamics, which have a significant impact on timbre and audibility when realized in sound in ways that might be quite different for each type of instrument. Section 6 of part 2 is a very impressive effort of the author doing his own measurements of audibility in live orchestra rehearsals. The measurements were conducted both with scientific rigor and musical insight. Considerable effort was put into developing instructive and communicative visualizations. However, some of them seem more easily interpretable than others, the orchestral masking graphs being a case where some results seemed a bit counterintuitive to me anyway. The timbral homogeneity heterogeneity issue is very interesting and is worth further analytical exploration, particularly in terms of both blend and the perception of orchestral richness. Part 3 tests SCORE tool's efficacy in use by the author and other composers. The author's own testing was conducted on his opera, also written for the artistic part of the project. The focus was primarily on the audibility of the voices in the orchestral texture, with specific examples recounted in the document. Several tests with other composers' pieces were also conducted in a similar manner. This process revealed ways in which the program was successful and others in which it required improvement. The candidate's honesty in this case is very laudable. Section 2 of Part 3 provides some very creative comparisons between composing and computer programming, which the candidate did both, actually. The whole approach makes an excellent contribution to orchestrational practice and potentially to its pedagogy as well, providing a tool that can be used for predictive purposes in the compositional process, or even to help solve problems identified at first rehearsal of a piece, as the author clearly demonstrates in the document. The project clearly provides an interesting path for creating a tool that is useful for practicing composers, and perhaps even for students of orchestration, and which potentially draws them into considering the why behind what happens in orchestration, rather than just the what that is developed in traditional orchestration classes and treatises. Overall, the document is very well written with few language errors. It also represents a brilliant first step in integrating psychoacoustic knowledge into orchestration practice and scholarship. I would make a couple of suggestions for future consideration. One thing that can improve the predictions of audibility would be to use models of masking that consider temporal factors, not just spectral ones, such as fine-grained temporal masking and the unmasking effect of asynchronous onsets of notes, which you mentioned a bit in your talk today. The system could be extended to allow separate analysis of different orchestral layers to determine the extent to which they remain separately audible, and perhaps help understand why some layers occupy the foreground as being more salient, and others the background being less salient, perhaps due to greater salience which might be linked to a higher level of audibility in some sense. Thank you.
Okay. Now, we start the discussion. Stephen, would you like to go ahead and continue?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the excellent introduction, which really clearly laid out some of the main issues in a very didactic fashion. clarified a couple of issues I had in my own mind. One major question that arises for me is the notion of audibility. What kind of audibility are we talking about? Is the audibility of a single instrument or a voice? It is the audibility of a group of blended instruments or voices against other aspects of an orchestral texture. Could it even be the audibility of one orchestral layer over others, occupying a foreground issue? I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you're talking about in this particular case.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I started with the audibility of single instrument, just to see if I can hear that single voice from the orchestra. But then, as I composed, I realized that that is not often the case. I want to hear the whole instrument section or some texture I created. So I added possibility to test the audibility of a group of instruments. But then we came to the timbre homogeneity, because I realized that we cannot test the group unless the sound is homogenic.
And so that might be a case then where issues of blending comes into play a role as well, wouldn't it?
Yes, blending is another issue, and blending is often desirable. And for example, in Scortum now, the blending test is done in a way that if the target is dissolving into the orchestration. So I'm concerned to bring it in the app, to bring it to more importance to the blending, because most of the composers like when sounds blend together.
Yes, it depends on the function. I mean, there's interesting cases, I think a lot of in Wagner and both Debussy as well, or the French composer Germain Taillefer, where audibility issues evolve. So particularly in Taillefer's Ballade for piano and orchestra, you have cases where the piano is actually in the foreground, but then at some point it sort of moves into the background and blends with other instruments and comes back, and it's actually the aim to have this sort of back and forth that's going on as well. So I'm curious how your program would react to such a situation.
Yes, actually, I maybe in recent months I tested the blending part the most, and also this comes to this sonic scene analysis you mentioned, that blending is perhaps not enough to test for single orchestral chord, but it must be tested for the whole texture. So I think that might be the next approach after this degree.
Well, thank you for that answer. Another point I'd like to raise is you seem to do a good job of pointing out the lack of distinction between masking and blending in orchestral treatises. And I'm just curious, how do you make that distinction in your work? We just talked a little bit about that, but I wonder, you state sometimes that masking can be seen as a unidimensional quality, but it seems to me it's more of a process rather than a quantity itself. Things can be masked either partially or wholly, and sometimes they might be masked partially because they're then blending with another instrument, and you don't hear the instrument as an identity, but rather something that's coloring another instrument. And it's also a very continuous phenomenon. It's not an all or none situation in that case. So I'm wondering how you might think about sort of implementing this more continuous aspect of degrees of masking and its very tight interaction with blending in your program.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the masking is actually quite tricky with the orchestration, because if you hear some parcels of the instrument tone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you hear the instrument sound. You may hear the irrelevant parcels. And also then the case might be that the sound actually blends more than is masked. So they are partly the same thing. And maybe that's why for example, Samuel Adler and Walter Piston does not distinguish masking and blending from one another. And they are speaking about inaudibility, that some sound blends into another, and on the other place inaudibility when they cannot hear some sound from the orchestra. And I interpret that the other one was masking and the first one was blending. But there are a lot of cases when it's not really clear whether they are talking about masking or blending. And in SCOTUL program, I separated those concepts so that blending is when the sounds are very similar to one another, and masking is where some texture is overpowering the intended target.
I think this is a very interesting area, and even in the science, we don't completely know how to separate out some of the issues that are involved. I'm thinking now of work by Gregory Sandel, who proposed that there's basically two kinds of blending. One which he calls a timbral augmentation, which is where one instrument or maybe an instrument section of similar instruments can be identified as such. So identification is the important part. They can be recognized, and yet they are colored, highlighted, or embellished by other instruments. And then the other case, which he calls timbral emergence, which is none of the instruments that are constituents of the sonority can be identified as such, and you get a sort of a completely new timbre that emerges. But even in the case of timbral augmentation, so you get this issue of can I identify or can I not identify? And even in timbral augmentation, there's the whole question of, is it masking or not in that particular case? Well, if it's changing the color, then it's not completely masked, because some of the partials of that instrument are affecting the timbre of this instrument. So I think one of the ways to sort of help define the notion of masking, particularly total masking, is that if you have an instrument, a set of instruments playing simultaneously, and you take one out and you can't hear the difference, then that's masking, because it's not contributing anything at all. But if you take it out and the color changes, then it is making a significant contribution at a level of perception. Now, obviously, I wouldn't expect you to be able to model that, because we don't even completely understand how it works at a psychoacoustic level either. But I wondered if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think one example could be unison between horn and cello section. The colors of those two are quite similar. So when they are playing together, you actually hear the both timbres quite well. You hear that cello is playing and horn is playing, and if one is taken off, something is missing. But they complete each other quite well.
Thank you. That's okay for me now.
Okay, so I have a question. By the way, can you move the flowers? It's exactly on the way. Thank you. Now you are coming to the last day of your doctoral work. In reflection, do you think this opera was the most appropriate example or even sample to demonstrate your thinking with regards to the score tool, and also the topic as a whole?
Yes, for me, the opera project was quite successful, and there were places still in the performance when I was not totally satisfied with the balance between orchestra and singers. But overall, I think there were many places and sections where actually the orchestration, thick orchestration supported the singer quite well, and you can still hear the singing voice clearly. So I was very satisfied for those.
Okay, then the next question is something we raised in the statement, the distinction between the audibility and intelligibility.
Yeah, traditionally, if I ask you, do you understand everything people sing in Puccini, for example, because that doesn't happen very often in opera, especially with female voices in high register, the intelligibility, it's maybe not even possible. So in the lower register, maybe more, that is the case, of course, especially for coloratura soprani. But I think the intelligibility is one issue that could be implemented in score tool because vocals have formats, and we know quite well where the formats lie when humans speak or sing. So the format areas could be implemented in the program and checked if the text is intelligible in the score. But I don't actually know if that would be worth of the effort, because it might be hard to program and hard to input text there, and there are lots of issues, but a good point.
Can I just follow up on that? I think there is more than one understanding of what intelligibility is about, and intelligibility of text, textual intelligibility is one. Another intelligibility, for example, is of a particular emotional state, which does not have to rely on whether you can hear the words or whether the words are comprehensible or not. It is something to do with the tone with which the voice expresses itself. And in that sense, sometimes it's I suppose it's related to the other kinds of intelligibilities. For example, I may hear a voice, but I may not register what that voice is trying to express. So intelligibility, and in this case, in the opera, we are talking about what the characters are trying to convey. The question is, of course, the audibility is important, but being audible alone may not necessarily address the question of intelligibility in that sense. And I'd like to hear your comments on this.
Yeah, I think we are now stepping in the field of aesthetics.
Indeed.
Also, and that is not the topic of my project, but I can answer also to that. Yes, aesthetics is an important aspect in opera, of course, but for this project, I researched mainly about the actual acoustical sound, whether you can hear it or not, and did the composition work at the side of that. So what I composed was something that is hard to put into words how it happens. So it just happens while I'm playing the piano or imagine something, the music I want to hear, and I usually do not think that much that kind of intelligibility you are talking about when I compose.
Thank you.
Some more questions? Okay, please, Steve.
Yes, I have some more specific questions if we have time. One is fairly early on, like it's on page 17 of the final book version. You're talking about Piston's observations can be contradictory, and you cite two examples. One is the viola is nasal, the tendencies sound unduly prominent, and yet a few pages later, Piston states that the quality of the viola tone is such that it's easily covered by accompanying sounds. The other example is that the muted trumpet is a piercing sound, but later he says that it blends especially well with the English horn. And I'm wondering if this criticism isn't a bit of an oversimplification in the sense that these would happen in completely different musical contexts. And so I'm wondering if the sort of the context, a given sound is always going to have a different effect and a different perception depending on the musical context in which it's sitting. So I'm wondering if you might consider a little bit or explain to us a bit how you think musical context affects these kinds of things, which I think your program is trying to do actually.
Yeah, that is very true that the context is important, but I think Piston describes, for example, trumpet often, that especially muted trumpet has a piercing sound. And if you write that in the handbook, so you actually might think that if I want a piercing sound in my piece, so I write muted trumpet. So, and later on, if when Piston said that it blends especially well with the English horn, so that sounds like it's not piercing anymore, or they may create a piercing sound together. But actually, I don't quite understand how the piercingness disappears with the English horn from muted trumpet.
I think it still has some. I'm taking immediately an example from Debussy, for example, in La Mer. There's a place where he mixes a muted trumpet and an English horn, and he's trying to get a kind of a foghorn-like sound. And so the English horn has a very round, rich sound, but he makes it somehow more strident. And yet, so it gives that more piercing, strident quality to the English horn sound, but they do blend together, but it's still got that kind of aspect to it, which is in a way that it's modifying the English horn. That for me is a good example of a tempo emergence, because it sounds like neither a muted trumpet nor an English horn once they blend together, if they're performed correctly, the balances are right, and they're synchronous, and all these other factors that come into play.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, thank you.
If I can ask another question. You state that in general, the focus of your thesis is not on temporal changes of sound. And I understand that's the first easy place to start is just focusing primarily on the spectral aspects. But a lot of temporal relations, and notably in amplitude envelope and onset characteristics, play a very strong role in concurrent grouping and blending, which is something that we need to pay attention to, which is why it's very difficult to find, it's possible that it's more difficult to blend impulsive instruments like pluck and struck instruments with sustained instruments like blown and bowed instruments and so on. So I'm wondering, how would you include such features in a future version of a score tool that these things are obviously, when you say something's going to be more a sharp attack, even with a sustained instrument, you can sometimes get, you'll have a scrunch on the violin. How would you take into account these sort of fine-grained performance factors and create a model of them that you could still work from a score in a certain sense?
Yeah, this actually approaches to the playing the whole score accurately with the computer, and that is something I think the notation programmers, program programmers try to do all the time. And it's not an easy task, because you have to interpret the dynamics in relation on what beat in the bar they are, and all that. So, and if they haven't figured out how to do it, I don't know how I can, because it's a very difficult task to do, and perhaps demands some kind of machine learning or deep learning algorithms.
Yeah, and it's always going to depend on the way things are actually performed. But there's always even in the whole realm of, well, let's take Sandel's notion of timbral heterogeneity, where you hear the two sounds completely independently, or timbral augmentation, where one dominates and the other embellishes, or timbral emergence, where they all completely fuse into a new timbre that's not recognized. You can actually move between those three different cases with a given score, depending on how it gets performed by the conductor. Bolero is a great example, Ravel's Bolero, because I've listened to about 20 or 30 recordings of that, and you never get the same thing from one recording to the next, depending on, even though he's got it all set up, they're starting at the same time, they're playing in harmonic intervals, they're moving perfect parallel in terms of dynamics and pitch, and yet sometimes they blend and sometimes they don't, which I think is a very critical issue.
And I have also Ravel's Bolero as an example in the thesis. And if I remember correctly, I mentioned that the onset times are really important.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You ask a technical question then? On example 37, I never did quite understand this on page 105 for your masking graph visualization thing. It was never quite clear to me how you created this, what's it called here? It's the ideal orchestration format. How do you derive that? Is it dependent on a particular place in the score, or is it something more general that you're deriving?
Actually, that was first in first person. That ideal orchestration format was part of the thesis, but I took it away because it was too problematic. It's the inversion of Singer's format, because in Singer's format, this original paper, ideal orchestration is illustrated so that it peaks on 300 hertz point, and then the Singer's format appears on 3 to 4 kilohertz frequency point. So I think that might be the ideal way to orchestrate a full-bodied sound, to have orchestration that peaks at 300 hertz and maybe have quite a lot of low frequencies as well. So that's what's indicated in that graph. But you are correct; it is not written out in this thesis.
Okay, thank you. That's much clearer for me. May I ask one more question? On page 30, it seems to me that you're saying that timbre couldn't play a role in hierarchical musical structuring, which seems, as somebody who's spent a lot of time looking at perceptual hierarchies of grouping and the role that timbre plays in them, I found that a bit surprising. So it seems to me that there are some large-scale aspects of timbre, such as orchestral layers or timbral contrasts, and the role timbre plays in sectional contrasts and things like that, that really can strongly play out hierarchical role in structuring. If you look at, for example, the various pieces that have been reorchestrated even by the composers for four-hands piano compared to an orchestral version, I'm thinking of Rite of Spring, for example. I've heard a version that's for 8 hands, 4 pianos. And there's a lot of hierarchical structuring that completely disappears because you don't have the timbral changes that are going on. So I'm wondering what you think about that whole issue.
Yes, I think that's another one, another aesthetic issue. I personally used to write music that was based mostly on timbre, but by doing that 3 or 4 pieces, I concluded that it's not enough for a main idea for a piece. So that's maybe more an aesthetics question than a technical statement.
But I think it's perceptual because, I mean, obviously timbre is working with a lot of other things. Even if we make changes in register, it's not just pitch that's changing. Timbre changes with pitch on any given instrument. Same thing with dynamics. And so all these things, timbre is also playing a very strong role. And when you do timbral contrast, I'm thinking of Sibelius' Second Symphony, where you're having all kinds of what we call timbral juxtapositions in our jargon, where he's got some musical material that's being contrasted with he's contrasting the musical materials, but he's adding on top of that stronger and making it stronger by actually creating these choruses between different instrument groups that are playing and things like that. So to me, it's like the timbre is contributing with other factors in the structuring itself. And if you take that away, I find that sometimes the structuring is not quite as strong. So it's less of an aesthetic question there than it is actually timbral difference is helping create boundaries that help create structure. And then you also associate certain kinds of timbres. Sort of Stravinsky's and Varese are both very good at this, where timbral colors actually create moments in pieces that you refer to, and they help build the sort of the large scale structure of the piece itself in your mind based on timbral similarities and differences.
But in those examples, I think it's linked also to the harmony, because if it's only about timbre, you have to have a single harmony or single note and just change the timbre. And those pieces are very few, maybe Celsi have some of them. But for example, Sibelius, the harmony is very important parameter also in that section.
I'm saying it works with everything else, but if you take out the timbre, so I take Sibelius' Second Symphony and I try to make a piano version of that, there are some things that are going to disappear. Not as strong, I think, because of the way he actually uses the orchestra in a brilliant fashion, in fact.
Yes, it's not clear to me how do you take out the timbre without harmony. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, you could make a piano transcription of it.
Yeah.
And see what still exists and what then goes away. I mean, the good Rite of Spring, for example, is a great example where, particularly in terms of not only structure but also emotional tone, for example. And that's maybe more in the realm of emotion and aesthetics, but if you take the timbre out, the timbral differences, the timbral colors that are communicated by, like all those, sort of 6 viola divisi and muted, you just can't get the same thing on a piano, for example. So.
Yeah, that's of course, yeah, the most beautiful orchestral pieces are such that you cannot write a piano transcription out of those. Yeah.
Without losing something. Yeah. You can still recognize it from the melody and the harmony, but that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Okay, we're done with this discussion. So the closing statements. That one, yes.
Oh, okay.
Please go ahead.
Me first. Okay. On the grounds of the statements heard, the materials examined, and the discussion heard today, I propose that the demonstration of proficiency of Uljas Pulkkis is accepted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Music.
Thank you. You, Professor McAdams, please.
On the grounds of the thesis and the discussion heard today, I propose that the thesis be accepted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Music.
After this, I recommend that those esteemed persons present who might have critical comments on my demonstration of proficiency ask the chair for the floor.
And it's possible to give comments in English or Finnish. Voitte siis esittää kysymyksiä myös suomeksi. Please introduce yourself before your question and be concise. Ole hyvä. Tapio Tuomala.
Täällä on myös mikrofoni, jos haluaa käyttää.
Mulla on pulvainen. Ani. Tuommoinen Tapio Tuomela. Teaching First of all, congratulations, Uljas. This is a very welcome contribution to
Tapio, please speak to the
many
mic.
of us. I hope you're. It's on.
Nyt on.
Is it on? Yes, no, so.
Tapio Tuomela is the composer.
And teaching orchestration, that's actually my main job here at this school. And I was particularly interested to come and hear Uljas's contribution. And I guess our younger colleagues will be as glad as I am of this, and I hope the score tool will be developed to serve us all. I think it's a very successful and bold effort to explain a very complex history of orchestration, and as it will evidently help a lot of future generations, it's quite clear that a lot of the tradition will be and has always been carried on as touched information, and as we know, that comes with a lot of rehearsals and sitting or playing in the orchestra or conducting. And as we know, many of great orchestrators of the history are both composers and conductors at the same person. Now, my only observation, perhaps slightly critical, would be about the tools, the technical tools. It's evident that the results that you get this way are kind of more quantitative and not qualitative, because you're measuring things with scales. And
Do you have a question?
I do, and it's bound with differentiation of layers, which we heard from Voice of America, from Mr. McAdams. And actually, two matters that might be interesting in this view. Basically, he was also, Mr. McAdams was talking about timbre as part of way of differentiating the orchestral layers. The other thing is the hierarchical character of orchestra, so that actually there's a lot of interplay between orchestral groups. And actually this is something that you need not discuss that much about how the groups blend and how, if I just give two very simple examples, in which manner, for instance, orchestration by Schumann and Debussy differ from one another. Perhaps you could open up your thinking about the importance and possibilities actually that score tool could have in the future to take more into consideration the qualitative aspects that this timbre may offer.
Yes, thank you, Tapio. You are absolutely correct that there are so many parameters in orchestration that I did not address in the thesis or in the program. The section playing is one, but when you code a program, you have to be very precise and tell the computer what you are looking for and what the parameters are. And if you think of a section playing, I couldn't tell here right away what are the parameters to feed into the program to get some results. So if you can provide more information, maybe after this occasion, so I will gladly hear them and implement into the program.
Thanks.
Just for Tapio, it's the voice of Canada.
Any more questions? If not, the examination is closed. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Coffee and cake outside the hall. Kahvi ja kakku. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure.